The fog over the Seine had a way of swallowing sound, as though Paris itself conspired to keep secrets in the dead of night. A lone lamp flickered on the embankment, its glow trembling in the mist, while footsteps echoed faintly across the cobblestones leading toward the Quai des Orfèvres. Inside, behind thick walls and frosted windows, Inspector Maigret sat with his pipe clenched in the corner of his mouth, the room heavy with the aroma of stale tobacco. It was here, in that timeless hour when sleep presses against the lids of ordinary men, that the telephone rang. The call was brief, the voice low and deliberate, almost a whisper carried by the wires. No name was given, only a sentence, cold and measured, a warning that seemed less like a threat than a confession. From that instant the case belonged not to evidence or logic alone, but to shadows, memory, and the restless pulse of a city where the night itself appeared to be complicit. If this story draws you into the same atmosphere of rain-slicked alleys and smoke-filled cafes, then remain close. More voices will emerge from the darkness, more lives revealed beneath the lamplight. Share this world with others who are drawn to the quiet persistence of Inspector Maigret. And if you would like to return again, subscribe so that the fog and the footsteps may always find you waiting. Now let us unfold the chapters of this investigation. The fog had settled thickly over Paris that evening, the kind of fog that blurred the outlines of bridges and drowned the voices of late-night wanderers. From the Quai des Orfèvres, where the Seine moved in slow darkness, Maigret could see nothing of the opposite bank, not even the faint silhouettes of the bookstalls that usually loomed like patient sentinels. The lamps burned in yellow halos, their light dissolving into the mist before it touched the ground. Inside the inspector's office, the glow of his desk lamp seemed almost too strong, too intrusive, casting the familiar objects into sharp relief. The heavy telephone, the battered files stacked neatly in their leather straps, the ashtray crowded with the remnants of his pipe. The silence of the room pressed against him, broken only by the faint dripping of rain against the window ledge. It was well past midnight, that hollow hour when Paris belongs neither to the respectable nor the criminal, but to the few in between. The cab drivers dozing in their seats, the concierges yawning at their doors, the lost souls wandering without destination. Maigret had not intended to remain so late, but something in the atmosphere of the day had left him restless. He had lingered, finishing paperwork he could have left for the morning, tamping and relighting his pipe without urgency, as though waiting without knowing for what. When the telephone rang, its sound felt too sudden, too sharp for that quiet. He reached for it almost reluctantly, the stem of his pipe shifting from one side of his mouth to the other. The line crackled faintly, as though carrying its message through more distance than the city alone. Then came the voice, low, steady, and curiously devoid of accent, the sort of tone that might belong to a schoolteacher or a clerk, someone accustomed to being heard, but not remembered. "You will not know my name," the voice said, "but by morning there will be blood on the stones near Saint-Martin." The words hung there, not hurried, not dramatic. Maigret listened without interruption, his thick fingers tightening slightly around the receiver. He thought for an instant that the caller might continue, but there was only silence, then the faintest exhalation, like a sigh carried through the wire. The connection clicked, and the line went dead. Maigret remained seated, the receiver still in his hand, the office once again filled with the muffled quiet of fog and rain. He drew in a slow breath through his pipe, though the tobacco had gone out long before. His eyes shifted to the window, where only his own reflection gazed back at him, vague and softened by the mist outside. He knew the difference between the hoaxes that sometimes plagued the station, drunken voices slurring threats, students daring one another, and the calm deliberation of this voice. This was not a joke, nor was it quite a threat. It had been spoken more as a certainty, as though the caller himself had resigned to the outcome. He set down the receiver gently, almost carefully, as though afraid of disturbing the fragile silence that had followed. In the corridor outside, the steps of a night constable echoed faintly, then faded. Somewhere below, a door closed with a hollow thud. Maigret felt the weight of the call pressing on him more heavily than the lateness of the hour. He stood, filling the room with his large, broad-shouldered presence, and crossed to the window. The glass was cold against his hand, and beyond it, the Seine flowed unseen, its surface lost in vapour. It was in such moments that Maigret's instinct, honed not by deduction alone, but by years of listening to the timbre of voices, the hesitation of liars, the stubborn quiet of the guilty, spoke more loudly than any evidence. He could feel in his bones that the voice belonged to someone already caught in the machinery of inevitability, someone who had decided upon a course and yet sought, in the dark anonymity of night, to be heard, if not understood. Why else call the police without leaving a name? Why deliver a warning rather than an alibi? He reached for his hat and heavy overcoat. The building seemed unusually hollow as he descended, his footsteps echoing along the stone stairwell. The duty sergeant glanced up from his ledger with weary surprise, but Maigret only gave a curt nod, pushing out into the cold damp of the embankment. The fog wrapped itself around him immediately, the air thick with the smell of wet stone and the river's metallic breath. His pipe had gone cold in his pocket, but he kept it between his teeth like a companion. The walk along the quay felt endless, each step swallowed by the mist, each lamp-post appearing only when he was nearly upon it. He turned into Rue de Harlay, the silence broken by the occasional clatter of a horse's hooves muffled in the fog, the rattle of a carriage unseen. He thought of the words again, blood on the stones near Saint-Martin. The district was broad, stretching from the canal to the noisy markets, filled with alleys where anything could happen unseen. Yet the caller had chosen those words deliberately. Saint-Martin was not only a place but a suggestion, a crossroads of respectability and vice, where cafes stayed open late and lodgers came and went without questions. He did not walk there at once. Instead, he let the city impress itself upon him, the mood of the night pressing closer with each step. At Place Dauphine, a lone figure leaned against the wall of a café shuttered hours before, humming tunelessly to himself. Across the river, faint bells tolled the hour from a church hidden in the fog. Maigret paused beneath a lamp, his breath mingling with the mist, and listened to the city breathing around him. It was not evidence he sought in that hour, but atmosphere, the intangible presence of something waiting to unfold. The call had set the night in motion, and now the fog seemed less like weather than like a curtain concealing a stage where the next act would soon begin. He felt no urgency to rouse his men yet, no reason to send telegrams or alarms. What he required first was understanding, the silent comprehension of a hunter who knows his quarry not by sight, but by the subtle signs of disturbance left in the forest. Back at his apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir, Madame Maigret stirred in her sleep as he entered quietly. He hung his coat to dry, placed his hat carefully on the stand, and stood for a long moment at the window overlooking the wet boulevard. He did not light the lamp, but let the dim light from the street seep into the room, sketching his broad outline against the curtain. His pipe remained unlit in his mouth, the familiar weight grounding him. He considered whether to wake Janvier or Lucas, to send them prowling through Saint-Martin before dawn. Yet he knew that haste could scatter traces more than reveal them. Better to wait, to let the city turn in its sleep, to allow the caller's words to ferment in the darkness until morning. For in Paris, night was a veil, and only in the pale, grey hours after dawn would the stains, the footprints, the half-closed shutters betray the truth of what had passed unseen. Maigret remained at the window long after the last tram had rattled away, his heavy frame motionless, his mind returning again and again to the calm, measured tone of the caller. It was not fear he had heard, nor anger, but something else, something like resignation, the echo of a man already lost. And as the fog thickened, binding Paris in its silence, Maigret felt the certainty that when dawn came, the voice would no longer be a voice alone, but a body lying among the stones. Morning did not so much arrive as seep into Paris, a thin, colourless light that made everything look older, like a photograph that had faded in a pocket. The fog had not lifted. It clung to the roofs and slid along the gutters with a patient insistence. Maigret dressed without haste, the same ritual as always, the weight of his overcoat settling on his shoulders like a decision already made. He nodded to Madame Maigret as she set his cup on the table, and she, with that quiet instinct of hers, saw that he tasted the coffee rather than drank it, his gaze already a few streets away. He said little. A kiss to her cheek, a hand briefly on her shoulder, then the door closing behind him with the soft thud of the day beginning. He walked against the grain of the morning, up toward Montmartre, where the streets lifted their narrow chins into the mist. Rue Caulaincourt revealed itself in fragments, an awning beaded with damp, a florist rolling open his shutter with a clatter, a concierge sweeping a doorway as if brushing yesterday into the gutter. At the corner, a small café carried the smell of last night's smoke, braided with the first bitter steam of coffee. Its wooden door creaked in a way that suggested it had always creaked, and would continue to do so when faces now young were old. Inside, a yellow lamp burned too high, laying a film of brightness over the zinc counter, the sticky rings left by glasses, the mirror clouded with breaths that had long since cooled. The patron behind the counter was one of those men who seem designed by the city for counters and accounts. A narrow face with a careful moustache, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a towel thrown over one shoulder as if it had grown there. He glanced up at the inspector without surprise. Policemen were part of the trade in Paris, like milk deliveries and Sunday church bells. Maigret removed his hat, shook a little moisture from the brim, and felt the warmth of the room climb into his overcoat like a cat. "You open early," Maigret said, his voice gentle with the hour. "Never closed," the patron replied, which was not true, but near enough. "Café?" Maigret nodded and set his hat on the counter. Around them, the empty tables looked as though their occupants had only just risen to stretch their legs outside. Chairs crooked, a scarf forgotten on a seat, a newspaper folded to the racing pages with a pencil lying across a name. From the back room drifted the tired clink of cups and the smell of a stove struggling against the damp. "You had someone here last night," Maigret said, and the patron's eyes flicked, not in denial, but to fix the hour in his mind. A man who left suddenly, a chair pushed back, a glass half drained. The patron waited a respectful moment before answering, masking curiosity with the careful neutrality of his profession. "People leave suddenly when they remember where they are meant to be, or when they are where they should not be." He set the cup before Maigret. "Black?" "Black," Maigret said. He warmed his hands on the cup, but did not yet taste it. He wore a cologne, cheap, something that wanted to be important. The patron smiled with one corner of his mouth. Many men wear important colognes when they climb the hill at night. Important to themselves, that is.
Provincial boots, Maigret added as though thinking aloud. Mud that was not Paris. The patron nodded, as if Paris kept a ledger for mud too. He sat near the window, not to look out, to see his reflection. Some men do that when they are trying on a new face. He polished a glass that was already clean. He asked the time twice without looking at the clock. Did he speak to anyone? A woman came in late enough to be early. She did not remove her gloves. They did not know each other, but they spoke like people who have practiced their lines in separate rooms. He reached under the counter and produced a saucer. She ordered an anisette and left it full. The chair, Maigret said. The suddenness. He rose just after the tram passed, the patron said. The old one from Avenue Junot. He dropped a coin, caught it, smiled as if someone had seen the trick. No one had. The patron's eyes went to the door, remembering the draft. He paused there as if listening. Then he left. He did not look back. And the woman? She stayed, the patron said, long enough to be embarrassed by staying. She left without the anisette, and it left a ring on the table like a wedding around a finger that had gone thin. Maigret lifted the cup at last. The coffee was strong enough to outlive the spoon. He let it sit on his tongue, not for the taste, but because it lent a rhythm to thinking. The mirror over the counter held his figure blurred in the film of old smoke, the same way the city kept its people slightly indistinct until it decided otherwise. He turned slightly, surveying the tables without moving from his place. Near the window, a chair was pushed a few centimeters askew from the habit of someone who liked escape more than comfort. On the tabletop, the ring from the untouched anisette had left a pale halo, still damp at one edge. Beside it, a match burned to a third, the charred tip flattened, where a nervous thumb had pressed it out too soon. Did he leave anything behind? Maigret asked. A smell, the patron said, and an impression. Impressions fade. Not in fog, the patron countered mildly. A woman emerged from the back room with a tray of clean cups and halted when she saw Maigret in the way of those who expect police to be looking for someone they know. He gave her a nod that said he was not hunting for the living at that moment. She relaxed into a small shrug and began aligning cups by size as if they might,
someday, be judged on discipline. Describe him, Maigret said, as if he were asking the weather and would know if the answer lied. Mid-30s, the patron said. Hair that has been cut too recently, as if the barber was given urgent instructions, not tall, not short. Clothes that tried to be quiet and made noise. He wore his hat like a compromise between a clerk and a man who thinks the night owes him a favor. Hands. Restless, the patron said. He rubbed his thumb against his ring finger as if there were a ring that wasn't there. And the woman? Gloves, he repeated. Better gloves than her coat deserved. Her hat was provincial, too brave for Paris. He glanced at the window as if the hat might still be crossing the street. She looked at the door each time it opened, not because she expected someone, but because she feared to see no one. You said they spoke, Maigret murmured. You did not hear the words. I heard the silence, the patron said. It was the kind of silence that comes after people have already decided the things they will not say. She put the coin for her drink on the table before she ordered. He touched his pocket often, checking something that was not money. A letter? Maigret suggested, remembering the unposted one he would later find on Boulevard Saint-Martin, as if the city had already brought the two scenes into his hands. But that belonged to a later hour, for now it was only the echo of an intuition. Perhaps, the patron said, or a key, or a ticket he was rehearsing the courage to use. Maigret stood and walked to the window table. He did not touch the ring of anisette or the match. He bent until his face came level with the surface, as if the scratches on the old wood might whisper something the room would not. The street beyond showed itself in grey bands, a cart creaking past, a boy in a cap running errands for a bakery that had learned long ago that bread must be ready before hunger knows it will be hungry. Across the way, a doorway stood half open, revealing a staircase that smelled, even from here, of cabbage and soap. "Who else was here?" Maigret asked, without turning. "Two men from the tram company," the patron said, "cards in their pockets and grease on their cuffs. A woman who speaks only to her dog. She leaves crumbs on the floor for him to decide whether she is generous." "Did any of them speak with our man?" "They noticed him in the way people notice a draft. Nothing more." Maigret returned to the counter and placed a coin beside his cup. "If he returns," he said, "let the door creak as much as it wishes." "He will not return," the patron said, with the absolute conviction of someone who knows his street. People who sit at that table only return when they have become someone else. At the door, Maigret paused. The smell of the cologne had receded into the general tapestry of the place, but it left behind an idea, a kind of false confidence that clung to the memory of the chair. He stepped out into the damp and drew the fog into his chest until it made the inner lining of his coat feel like a sponge. Up the street, Rue Caulaincourt tilted into a silence that made sounds seem deliberate. Maigret turned toward the small square where a newspaper boy hawked sheets that would darken with rain before the ink could fully dry. He bought one, more for the ritual than the news, and scanned the headlines with a practiced indifference that saved his attention for the smaller columns, the little notices where people hid their affairs in plain sight. There it was, a few lines near the bottom, a postage stamp of text that a man might read and forget or remember too well. A missing person notice from Dijon, a clerk named Adrien Besson, absent from his lodgings 3 days, described by a landlady who had noticed not his absence but the silence of his room. He had left with a single valise and had told no one why. His description matched 10,000 clerks in France, and yet the phrasing, the way the landlady measured his soul by the angle of his hat on the peg, felt too familiar to ignore. A tram bell rang, throaty and tired. The old carriage groaned past like an animal roused from sleep to fetch its own breakfast. As it passed, a figure appeared on the opposite pavement, a woman in the same too brave hat the patron had described, its provincial courage dimmed by the damp. She paused under an awning, looking not at the café, but at the space above it, as if buildings might store yesterday in the shutters. Her gloves were off now, tucked into her coat, and the hands beneath them were pale and undecided. Maigret did not approach her. He watched the way her gaze moved, not in search of someone, but in search of a reason not to be seen waiting. She folded her arms and unfolded them, a rhythm learned in childhood to keep the cold from scalding the bones. When she turned, it was not to walk away, but to walk without destination, a fragile thing pushing itself into motion. He let her go. A net cast too soon only tangles in its own weight. He continued along the street, stopping at doorways, leaning into the respectable gloom of vestibules where smells kept their histories. At one landing he found a concierge polishing the brass that did not wish to be polished. She recognized his face from the penny newspapers and straightened her back as if receiving a guest of honor. Yes, she had seen a man last night heading up to the 3rd floor of the building opposite the café. No, he hadn't stayed long. He carried no valise. He carried a look that made people sorry for things they had not yet done. and his boots had left a line of dried clay on the stairs that did not belong to Paris. At the third floor, a door with flaking paint made its own introduction. No one answered when Maigret knocked, but the air that slipped through the keyhole smelled faintly of kerosene and damp wool. He didn't force it. Some doors opened better by waiting. He stood at the stairwell window and looked down at the street where the cafe door stood in its habit of being half open, the lamp within it holding a little gold against the grey. A boy pushed a broom past the curb, drawing a wet arc that caught the light like a blade. He returned to the pavement and crossed to the cafe once more. The patron met his eyes without surprise, as if the inspector's return had been as inevitable as the clink of the saucer he now set down. "You have the look of a man who has found both too much and not enough," the patron said softly. "I have the look of a man who must go to Saint-Martin," Maigret answered, and the name of the place fell into the room like a stone dropped into water, the ripples invisible but felt in the quiet. The patron nodded, then glanced toward the window table, where the ring of anisette had grown paler as it dried. If he sat there to watch himself, he might go to Saint-Martin to disappear. Maigret lifted his hat again. His pipe waited, patient as a trusted dog, and he tamped it with a thumb as broad and steady as a carpenter's. Outside, the fog seemed to draw back a finger's width, revealing the suggestion of a street further on, where carts rattled more surely and voices carried a little farther. He felt the city shifting, its daily muscles limbering into movement, and within that shifting a thread ran taut, from the quiet voice on the telephone to the pushed-back chair, from the deft coin caught at the door to the woman with brave gloves and a hat that did not forgive the weather. He walked down the slope, the air tasting faintly of coal and wet bread, and as he turned the corner, he did not look back at the café. It belonged to the hour that was closing. Ahead, the stones of Saint-Martin waited under the same fog, their day already decided, and though he could not yet see the blood the caller had promised, he felt the certainty of it the way sailors feel the swell before the wave shows its white. The tram's bell receded, a newspaper rustled, somewhere a door was locked twice instead of once, and Maigret, without hurrying, lengthened his stride. The boulevard outside their apartment carried the muffled hum of Paris awakening, yet inside the rooms of Boulevard Richard Lenoir the morning remained hushed, as though Madame Maigret herself preserved the silence with her steady presence. She was at the kitchen table, arranging a basket of vegetables that had arrived with the milkman, her hands moving with the unthinking assurance of habit. The little flame beneath the coffee-pot hissed faintly, a sound that joined the ticking of the clock and the occasional murmur of water in the pipes, the domestic chorus of the day beginning. Maigret entered without ceremony, his heavy overcoat still damp at the hem, his hat placed carefully on the rack, as though the weight of the fog clung to it. He kissed her on the cheek in that absent way of men who have been walking in thoughts too long, and she, accustomed to such greetings, did not question him immediately. Instead, she poured his coffee, strong and black, setting it before him with the ease of decades. He settled heavily into the chair, the wood groaning beneath his bulk, and drew the cup into his hands without drinking. The steam fogged the lenses of his gaze, but he seemed to look through it rather than into it. Madame Maigret studied him with the discreet attention of a woman who had long since learned that her husband's work left traces not in files or in newspapers, but in the lines of his face, the rhythm of his pipe, the pauses between his sentences. She noticed this morning that his pipe remained in his pocket, unsmoked, a small but telling detail. He cupped the coffee like an anchor, yet he did not sip it. His shoulders, broad as a butcher's, carried more than the damp of the fog. "You came in late," she said, her voice gentle, not reproachful. "Later than I thought," he murmured, his gaze wandering toward the window where the curtains let in a pale grey. He did not elaborate. She set a plate before him, slices of bread still warm from the bakery. He tore a piece absently, chewing without appetite, and she watched the way his jaw worked, slower than usual, as though he ate more for her than for himself. She sensed, in that subtle way of hers, that something had unsettled him. He was a man who could sit among murderers and not shift in his chair, yet she had seen him return home carrying the invisible weight of a voice or a look, something intangible that clung to him like fog. "There was a telephone call," he said finally, not looking at her. He said it in the way one admits a fact rather than begins a story. She waited, knowing that silence was more useful than questions. "A man," calm voice, "said there would be blood at Saint-Martin." He lifted his eyes at last, not to her face, but to the steam curling from his cup. No name. Nothing more. She absorbed this with the composure of someone who had lived too long beside such revelations to flinch. Her husband's work had always been a part of her life, as much as the meals she prepared or the errands she ran. She knew the shape of it, its suddenness, its hours, its shadows that followed him through the door like uninvited guests. Yet each case left a different trace upon him, and she tried, in her quiet way, to read these traces not as facts, but as impressions. "This voice," she said softly, "it has stayed with you." Maigret exhaled, finally retrieving his pipe, filling it with a practiced hand. The ritual seemed to restore him, the tamping of the tobacco, the striking of the match, the first draw that sent smoke curling like thought into the air. He leaned back, the chair sighing under him, and let the smoke drift toward the ceiling. "It was not fear," he said slowly, "nor anger. It was resignation, as though he spoke not to warn but to confess, as though he already knew how the night would end." Madame Maigret folded her hands in her lap, her gaze steady on him. "And you believe him?" "I believe his tone more than his words." He drew again from his pipe, eyes narrowing. "Words can lie, tone cannot." She watched him, and in her watchfulness lay something tender, almost maternal. Others saw in him the heavy presence of authority, the broad-shouldered inspector who could outweight a suspect into honesty. She alone saw the man who carried within him the doubts and impressions that the uniform did not permit him to voice. She offered him no advice, no speculation, only the simple solidity of her presence, a counterweight to the shadows he carried home. He reached for the bread again, this time with more appetite, dipping a corner into his coffee. She smiled faintly, reassured by the small gesture, though she knew it did not banish the call from his mind. Nothing would until the case reached its end, however far that end lay. After breakfast, he stood and reached for his hat. She helped him with his coat, brushing a damp fleck of fog from the sleeve. As he prepared to leave, she touched his arm lightly. "Take care," she said, and in her tone lay more than caution. It was the unspoken acknowledgment that his world and hers overlapped only at the threshold, and once he crossed it, he belonged again to the shadows of Paris. He kissed her cheek once more, this time with more presence, and stepped out into the boulevard. The door closed behind him, and she stood for a moment listening to his steps fade down the stairs. Then she returned to her basket of vegetables, resuming her tasks with the calmness of one who knows that her care was not in what she said, but in the silence she kept. Yet throughout the day, as she moved from kitchen to market, from sewing table to errands, The image of him at the table lingered in her mind, the untouched pipe, the coffee cooling in his hands, the look of a man who had heard a voice that was no longer a stranger's but an unseen presence in their home. She did not need to know the details to feel the weight of it. She carried it quietly, as she always had, in the space between her own heartbeat and his. The telegram arrived with the clatter of a messenger's bicycle bell, a sound that cut through the usual chorus of the Quai des Orfèvres like a stone striking glass. Maigret had been leaning at his office window, pipe smoke drifting lazily toward the fogged glass, when the duty sergeant appeared in the doorway holding the folded slip with the expression of a man who knows he carries more than paper. The inspector accepted it without a word, his thick fingers careful not to crease the flimsy sheet, for telegrams always carried the sharpness of urgency, as though the ink itself had been pressed in haste. The words were brief, stripped to their bone by the economy of telegraphy.
Dijon station master reports suspicious passenger boarding night train Paris. Ticket purchased under false name. Clark Besson missing 3 days. Stop. Valise in hand. Uncertain destination. Stop. It was signed with the neat flourish of a provincial commissaire whose name Maigret knew faintly, more from the exchange of documents than from personal acquaintance. He read it twice, each word seeming to settle deeper into the fog of his thoughts. Adrien Besson, the name pricked at him like a familiar scent caught on a stranger's coat. The notice from the newspaper that morning, the faint description tucked between advertisements for soap and spectacles, had mentioned the same missing clerk. Now Dijon added its own voice to the chorus, and the threads of coincidence began to resemble intention. He set the telegram down upon his blotter and pressed his palms flat against the wood, his eyes half closed. A clerk vanishes in Dijon, leaves behind a silence where his daily routine once ticked like clockwork. A man of uncertain description boards a train to Paris under another name, and in the depths of night a voice calls Maigret with the calm resignation of someone who has already decided the ending of his story. The inspector felt the weight of geography drawing itself tight, the rails of the railway like veins carrying inevitability toward the heart of Paris. Janvier appeared at the door, his hat still glistening from the morning drizzle. "Another telegram?" he asked, a note of curiosity muffled beneath his deference. Maigret gestured to the desk. "From Dijon. Our missing clerk seems to have boarded a night train for Paris." Janvier stepped closer, reading the words with the habitual frown of a man who trusted facts but distrusted their silences. "A false name," he murmured. "That speaks of intent." "Or fear?" Maigret said, relighting his pipe with deliberate slowness. "Perhaps both. We must learn which." The younger inspector waited, knowing that Maigret's silences were not voids, but spaces where connections took root. At last, the commissaire rose from his chair, with the heaviness of a man lifting not his body, but the weight of the case itself. "Send Lucas to the Gare de Lyon," Maigret ordered. "Have him speak to the night porters, the conductors. Someone will remember if a man carried himself with the air of pretending to belong." Janvier nodded briskly and disappeared down the corridor, his footsteps echoing on the stone like the rhythm of a telegram tapping itself out across distance. Left alone, Maigret returned to the telegram and studied it again. The words valise in hand lingered in his mind. There was always something revealing in what a man chose to carry when he abandoned his life. A single valise suggested not flight alone, but a kind of care, a decision about what must be preserved and what could be left behind. He thought of his own office, cluttered with files and relics, and imagined reducing his
existence to the confines of one small case. The weight of such a decision would not be visible on a ticket stub, but it would be heavy in the eyes of the man who carried it. The fog outside had thickened into a fine drizzle, and Maigret felt the dampness crawling along the stone corridors as he descended the stairs. He stepped into the courtyard, where the messenger's bicycle still leaned against the wall, drops of water trembling from its frame. The boy stood waiting, cap in hand, eyes wide with the curiosity of one who had delivered a message without knowing its content. Maigret handed him a coin, a gesture both of dismissal and quiet acknowledgement, and the boy pedalled off, his bell chiming faintly as he vanished into the mist. Maigret walked slowly toward the embankment, his pipe smoke mingling with the damp air. The Seine moved sluggishly beneath the bridges, its surface a dull pewter that reflected nothing but the pale sky. The inspector paused at the railing, his hands resting on the cold iron, and allowed himself a moment of stillness. He thought again of the voice on the telephone, calm and resigned, and tried to imagine it belonging to a provincial clerk named Besson. Could such a man, accustomed to ledgers and timetables, have acquired the tone of inevitability that had reached Maigret in the night? Or was the voice another's entirely, a shadow leaning upon the disappearance of Besson for its own design? He turned and made his way back toward the quay, the drizzle clinging to his coat. Inside he summoned Torrance, another of his inspectors, and dispatched him to question the telegraph clerks. "A missing man leaves Ripples," Maigret said. "Find out if Besson sent any messages before he vanished. To Paris, perhaps. To no one. To everyone. We must learn what words he thought urgent enough to send." As Torrance departed, Maigret sat once more at his desk and began leafing through the sparse file already forming on Besson. The provincial commissaire had enclosed a brief description. 34 years old, unmarried, a clerk in a shipping office, regular in his habits, punctual as a clock. He lived in modest lodgings kept by a widow who described him as polite, discreet, and unremarkable. No debts, no quarrels, no known vices. And yet he had vanished, leaving behind only the faintest disturbance in the routine that had defined him. Maigret studied the photograph clipped to the report, a narrow face, clean-shaven, eyes that seemed neither timid nor bold, but settled somewhere in between. A man who might walk past unnoticed in any street of Paris or Dijon. A man who could vanish without stirring more than a ripple, unless he himself wished to be found. By late afternoon, Lucas returned from the Gare de Lyon, his coat heavy with rain. He entered Maigret's office and set his hat down with the weariness of one who had spoken to too many indifferent witnesses. "The porters remember him," Lucas said. Not by name, of course, but a man with a valise hesitating at the barrier as though he were rehearsing his role. He asked which carriage, though his ticket showed it. Sat near the window, ordered coffee at one stop and barely touched it. "Alone?" Maigret asked. Lucas hesitated. "Not entirely. A woman joined the train at an intermediate station. Dark coat, gloves, a hat described differently by each witness. They spoke little, but there was something in their silence, as though they travelled together without admitting it." Maigret's eyes narrowed, the pipe smoke curling around his head like thought given form. "The same woman as in the café, perhaps?" Lucas shrugged. "No one saw enough to say." The inspector leaned back, his gaze drifting once more to the telegram. The words seemed now less like facts and more like pieces of a puzzle deliberately scattered. A missing clerk, a false name, a valise, a woman with gloves, and above all, a voice that had chosen the inspector's ear as its confessional. He rose abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "Prepare a request for Dijon," he said. "I want a list of his correspondences, his bank account, his colleagues. If Besson vanished, it was not by accident. He has left us breadcrumbs, but we must decide if they lead to safety or to blood on the stones." As evening drew its curtain over Paris, The telegram lay still upon the desk, its ink drying into permanence. Yet for Maigret the words did not rest. They pulsed with a rhythm that echoed the rails stretching from Dijon to Paris, carrying with them not only a missing man, but the shadow of an inevitability that had already spoken through the telephone in the night. The inspector tamped his pipe once more, struck a match, and let the smoke fill the room. He could almost hear the rumble of the train still echoing in the night, carrying with it a man who might already be dead, or who might even now be watching Paris from some window, waiting for his story to be discovered. The telegram had done its work. It had pulled the quiet disappearance of a provincial clerk into the heart of the capital, binding Maigret to a voice that refused to be silent. And as the inspector turned once more toward the rain-dimmed windows of the Quai des Orfèvres, he felt certain that Saint-Martin awaited him, and that the blood promised by the caller was only the beginning. The rain had deepened by the time Lucas and Janvier left the Quai des Orfèvres, each man turning his collar high against the drizzle that soaked Paris with an insistence that felt almost personal. The city was never still under rain, its stones darkened, its gutters filled with rushing filth, and the sounds of hooves, tram bells, and hurried footsteps became muted as though wrapped in wet cloth. The two inspectors moved through it without haste, yet without pause, their heavy coats dragging with water, their hats dripping in rhythm with their steps. They were accustomed to such nights. Paris belonged to the rain as much as it did to thieves or lovers. Lucas, broad and deliberate, walked with the quiet authority of a man who knew every alley between the Gare de l'Est and the Canal Saint-Martin. Janvier, younger, carried himself with an energy that rain could dampen but not extinguish, his sharp eyes restless under the brim of his hat. Together they formed a balance, the patient weight of experience beside the restless curiosity of youth. Their first stop was the concierge of a lodging-house near Boulevard de la Villette, a woman whose shawl smelled of damp cabbage and whose eyes narrowed at the sight of their badges. She remembered a man passing her door late the previous night, boots muddy, hat drawn low. He had not asked for a room, but had paused on the stairs as if considering. She had asked what he wanted, and he had mumbled something about directions, then left without further word. Polite, she said, but distracted, as if he carried a noise in his head no one else could hear. Lucas took her words down in his pocketbook, though he already knew the description matched 100 such wanderers. Still it was something, a footprint in the fog. From there they traced the streets toward Saint-Martin, the rain growing heavier, splashing from the awnings of shops that had long since closed. They questioned a night watchman leaning on his lantern near the canal, a man who had seen little but shadows crossing the bridge. One shadow walked faster than the others, he admitted, as if afraid the rain might erase him. Janvier gave him a cigarette for his trouble, the flame of his match flaring briefly in the wet gloom. In a café still open near Rue du Faubourg Saint-Martin, the inspectors found 3 coachmen hunched over glasses of rum, their caps wet, their faces red with the cold. The men spoke with the blunt candour of those accustomed to waiting for fares. Yes, they had seen a fellow matching the clerk's vague description. He had stood on the pavement for nearly half an hour, shifting from foot to foot, as though debating whether to climb into a carriage. He never did. Instead, he vanished into the rain, leaving only the impression of someone carrying a decision heavier than his valise. Lucas questioned them with slow patience, Janvier pressing for details. The answers were always the same, a man, ordinary, yet somehow unsettled. It was the kind of testimony Maigret valued most, not for its precision, but for its atmosphere. By midnight, their coats were plastered to their shoulders and their boots carried the weight of water. They paused under the arch of a narrow alley, where the rain dripped like a metronome from the eaves above. Lucas lit his pipe, shielding the match with his thick hands, and the brief glow illuminated the thoughtful heaviness of his features. "What do you make of him?" Janvier asked, pulling at his collar. "A man who doesn't know where he belongs," Lucas said, drawing on the pipe. "Paris is full of them. They arrive with a ticket, a valise, and a plan that never survives the first café." Janvier frowned. "But this one calls the inspector in the middle of the night. That's not confusion, that's intent." Lucas exhaled smoke that mingled with the mist. "Perhaps, or perhaps it is desperation. A man drowns, he calls for help. Sometimes he calls for a priest." They continued through the wet streets, speaking to whoever the rain had not yet driven indoors. A barmaid wiping down her counter remembered a pair, man and woman, sitting together but not speaking. "They had the look of conspirators," she said, though she admitted she had heard nothing of their words. A street sweeper, his broom leaving dark arcs on the pavement, recalled a man pausing beneath a lamp-post, staring at the water swirling into the gutter as if he might step into it. Each account was slight, fragmentary, yet together they formed a portrait not of clarity but of unease. The inspectors reported back to Maigret in the small hours dripping across his office floor. He listened without interruption, his pipe smoke curling steadily upward as their words filled the silence of the room. Lucas delivered his notes with measured certainty. Janvier added colour with the vividness of youth. Maigret absorbed it all, his eyes half closed. His great bulk leaned back as though weighing the details against the memory of the voice that had woken him. At last he stirred, knocking his pipe against the ashtray. "You have done well," he said, his voice low. "You have brought me the shape of a man, if not his name, polite, distracted, unsettled, carrying something heavier than a valise, seen in silence with a woman who did not drink. This is the portrait of our caller." Lucas nodded gravely. Janvier leaned forward, eager. "And what does it tell you, Chief?" Maigret looked at them both, his eyes heavy-lidded but alert. "It tells me he is a man torn between confession and concealment, a man who cannot walk the streets without leaving ripples, yet cannot sit in a café without betraying himself in silence. Such men do not vanish, they circle. They leave traces like smoke in a room." The rain continued through the night, beating against the windows of the quay, filling the gutters with its restless music. Lucas and Janvier remained in their chairs, their coats steaming faintly in the warmth of the office, while Maigret filled his pipe again and stared at the telegram from Dijon. The missing clerk had boarded a train under a false name. The man in Paris left behind impressions too numerous to be accidental. Somewhere in the overlap lay the truth, and Maigret, with his instinct sharpened by the fog and the rain, felt that truth drawing closer. For now, though, he dismissed his men with a wave of his hand. "Rest while you can," he said. "Tomorrow Paris will wake to the news, and we will no longer have the city to ourselves. Tonight it belongs to the rain, and to us." They left, their footsteps echoing down the corridor, the damp smell of their coats lingering in the office. Maigret remained, alone with his pipe, the telegram, and the sound of rain. He thought of the caller's voice once more, calm and deliberate, as if spoken not to warn but to unburden. And he wondered, as dawn approached, whether the man walked even now through the wet streets, watching the city with the eyes of one who knows his time has already been measured. The rain showed no sign of ceasing. It drummed against the shutters like fingers tapping out a code only Maigret could decipher. The rain had not yet exhausted itself by the time Maigret reached Boulevard Saint-Martin. Water slid along the awnings in steady ribbons, dripping into the gutter where the tram rails gleamed like dull knives under the gas lamps. The boulevard was never truly silent. Even at that hour it carried the restlessness of markets preparing their stalls, of carters shouting at horses reluctant to splash through puddles, of shop shutters rattling as their locks were tested. Yet the fog still clung low, curling along the facades, dulling the lantern light so that each figure passing seemed less flesh than shadow. Maigret's hat brim leaked onto his collar as he paused outside the building that had been described to him, number 142, a respectable though tired block of apartments with its paint flaking where the rain had gnawed it, the brass of the bell pull dulled by years of damp fingers. The concierge's lodge sat just inside the entryway, the air there heavy with the odour of cabbage and soap. The concierge herself, a stout woman with hair tied back in a bun that had known better days, eyed him with the suspicion that came naturally to her profession. "Yes, monsieur?" she asked, already wiping her hands on her apron, as if prepared to deny knowledge of anything. Maigret drew on his pipe, letting the smoke curl between them before speaking. "Third floor. A man rented a room here not long ago." Her eyes flickered, quick as a shutter, though her voice tried to remain even. "Rooms come and go, Inspector. People too. This is Paris." He said nothing, only fixed her with the patient gaze that seemed to fill the air around him until silence became unbearable. At last she relented with a small shrug. "He came 2 nights ago," she admitted. "Paid in advance, left no name, said he might stay only a short while, carried a valise, small, brown leather like a clerk would carry. He was polite enough, but distracted. I could smell cologne stronger than soap, and not the sort one buys in Paris." Maigret nodded, already certain this was the thread he sought. He climbed the stairwell, his heavy steps muffled by the worn carpet runner, and paused before the door on the third-floor landing. Its paint was cracked, its handle dull brass like the others, indistinguishable except for the faint smell that drifted through the cracks, kerosene mixed with damp wallpaper. He turned the knob and the door gave without resistance. Inside, the apartment breathed the air of a place neither lived in nor abandoned, but caught in suspension. The curtains were drawn hastily, leaving the room dim even by day. A single lamp on the table had burned low, its wick sunk in a pool of kerosene, casting a yellowish glow that flickered on the peeling wallpaper. The silence within was dense, as though waiting for a voice that had left only moments before. On the table lay a letter, folded but not sealed, its paper damp at the edges as if touched by hands uncertain. Maigret picked it up gently, scanning the neat but hurried script. The words were not addressed to anyone in particular, no name, no dear, only lines that seemed to waver between confession and explanation. "I did not intend to bring anyone else into this. Forgive me if it is already too late. There are things one cannot carry alone, you will see. By tomorrow, perhaps, it will be clear." The inspector read it twice, his thumb pressing the corner of the page flat. It was not a farewell in the romantic sense, nor quite a confession of guilt. It was the writing of a man caught between fear and inevitability, uncertain whether his words would ever reach the eyes for which they were meant. He crossed the room, noting the impressions left behind. The bed was neatly made, but the pillow bore the faint hollow of a head that had not rested deeply. On the washstand, a razor still damp with recent use, a comb with a few strands of hair clinging to its teeth. The valise itself was gone, but its absence was eloquent, for the dust on the shelf where it had rested was disturbed. The man had left in haste, but not without purpose. Near the window, Maigret paused. The glass was streaked with condensation, and when he rubbed it with his palm, he saw the boulevard below blurred by the rain. He imagined the man standing there before him, peering out into the fog, watching the lamps burn along the street as if searching for courage in the anonymity of Paris. It was easy to picture him, the narrow shoulders, the restless hands, the cologne masking the provincial earth, still clinging to his boots. A floorboard creaked behind him, and he turned sharply, only to find Janvier in the doorway, hat in hand, rain still dripping from his coat. "Chief," the young inspector said softly, as though not wishing to disturb the air of the room. "The neighbours saw him come and go, always alone, always late at night." "Did they hear anything?" "A sound of pacing once. Another time, the window opening. Nothing more." Maigret nodded, returning to the table. He set the letter down and struck a match for his pipe, the flame throwing shadows against the walls. "He left this," he said. "Not a confession, not quite, but enough to tell me he has already chosen his path." Janvier glanced at the letter, then back at his chief. "You think he means to kill?" Maigret exhaled smoke, his eyes narrowing. "Or to die, perhaps both, but he wanted us to know. That is why he called." The two men stood in silence, listening to the rain tapping at the window. Outside, the boulevard moved on, oblivious, carts rumbling, umbrellas tilting, children splashing through puddles. Inside, the room felt sealed, a capsule of intent left behind by a man who had already stepped into the next act of his story. "Have the letter analysed," Maigret said at last. "Ink, paper, handwriting. See if Dijon recognises it, and send Lucas to the post office. If he bought stamps or sent telegrams, someone will remember." Janvier nodded, slipping the letter carefully into his coat. He lingered a moment longer, his young eyes betraying curiosity. "Chief, why write a letter and not send it?" Maigret tamped his pipe, his expression unreadable. "Because sometimes writing is not for the reader, it is for the writer. He left it here because it had already served its purpose, to remind himself he was still alive when he wrote it." Janvier said nothing more. He tipped his hat and withdrew, his steps fading down the stairs. Maigret remained in the apartment, the smoke from his pipe mingling with the stale odour of kerosene, his large frame filling the room with stillness. He traced the lines of the wallpaper with his eyes, the faded flowers yellowed by time, the cracks in the plaster that seemed to spread like veins. Everything spoke of transience, of lives passing through without permanence. At length he turned down the lamp and left, pulling the door shut behind him. The corridor smelled of damp stone and cabbage again, and the concierge watched him from her lodge with the sharpness of one who wished to know but dared not ask. Maigret gave her only a nod, his pipe clenched firmly, and stepped once more into the rain. The boulevard stretched before him, slick and glistening, its carriages rattling, its shopkeepers raising shutters, its air filled with the mingled scents of wet bread and coal smoke. Somewhere along its length, perhaps in some other dim apartment, the man with the valise and the calm voice walked still, carrying within him the decision that had already been spoken through a telephone. And Maigret, hat pulled low, began to follow the invisible thread that bound the empty apartment, the unsent letter, and the voice in the fog, knowing that the city would soon reveal what the night had concealed. By the time the grey light of morning seeped across Paris, the story had already escaped the confines of the Quai des Orfèvres. News, like fog, had a way of slipping through shutters and under doors before the police could hope to contain it. A clerk from Dijon who vanished, a suspicious valise, whispers of a late-night caller. It was little enough to build upon, But the press never needed more than a whisper. With a few strokes of type they could make a shadow into a spectre, and a man who had simply left his lodgings could become the pivot of scandal. Maigret sat at his desk, the first edition spread before him. The headlines were small, tucked between notices of a ministerial debate and an account of a society ball. Mysterious absence of Dijon clerk, possible arrival in Paris. The ink smelled fresh, smudging the inspector's broad fingertips as he folded the paper. It would not remain small. By the next day or the day after, the city's appetite for drama would fatten the tale. Paris loved its mysteries. They gave the cafes something to argue about, gave the cabmen and the concierges a reason to speculate with authority. Lucas entered with another sheet, this one from an evening paper already rushing to print an update. Its tone was more florid, more dangerous. Is Paris shelter to a fugitive? Who is the woman seen at his side? A sketch done quickly and with little regard for accuracy showed a man in a hat, his eyes shadowed, a woman at his elbow, gloved and faceless. The artist had captured not likeness but suggestion, secrecy, complicity, intrigue. It was enough. They make him guilty already, Lucas muttered, his voice heavy with contempt. By tomorrow they will have him in chains. Maigret tamped his pipe, his eyes narrowing as he studied the drawing. Or they will have him dead, he said quietly. The press prefers corpses to trials. Trials grow dull. Death sells every edition. Janvier appeared then, his coat slung over his arm, cheeks flushed from the cold. He carried 3 more papers, each with its own angle. One suggested espionage. Was Besson a courier of secrets, a pawn in a foreign game? Another hinted at finance. Had he absconded with company funds? The third, more scandalous, wove a tale of illicit love, complete with insinuations about the unnamed woman who followed him like a shadow. They invent what they cannot know, Janvier said, dropping the papers on the desk. But the city reads it as scripture. By tonight the cafes will swear they saw him with their own eyes. Maigret puffed slowly, his gaze lost in the smoke that rose above the headlines. He knew too well the double-edged sword of publicity. At times the press could help, turning citizens into informants, bringing forth a witness too timid to approach the police otherwise. Yet more often it muddied the waters, drowning truth beneath a tide of rumour and embellishment. A witness might read a detail in the paper, and then remember having seen it, whether he had or not. A suspect might find his path blocked by lies before the truth could emerge. He rose and walked to the window. Outside, Boulevard du Palais bustled with clerks and messengers, their satchels bouncing against their coats, their voices sharp with morning haste. Across the river, the towers of Notre Dame loomed pale in the fog, their bells tolling the hour with indifferent solemnity. The inspector's reflection gazed back at him in the glass, blurred, smoke curling from his pipe, as if his thoughts themselves sought escape. He remembered cases past when the press had played its hand too strongly. The banker who had been accused of embezzlement before the evidence was even gathered, the young woman whose reputation had been destroyed by speculation before her innocence could be proven. The papers did not answer to justice, they answered to appetite, and appetite was endless. Turning back, he addressed his men. We must move faster than the papers. If they decide for the city what this man is, we will be chasing ghosts instead of truth. Every witness we speak to from this moment will come to us, already influenced by what they have read. Our task is not only to find him, but to unearth him from beneath the layers of fiction. Lucas nodded, his jaw set. Where shall we begin? The company where he worked in Dijon, Maigret said, have Torrance send inquiries, accounts, correspondences, colleagues. If there was money missing, we must know before the papers decide it for us. And the woman, always they will ask about the woman, we must know who she is before they turn her into a phantom. Janvier looked restless. And if she is no one, a chance companion, no more? Then we will say so, Maigret replied. But if we remain silent, the papers will give her a name, a face, a story. They will convict her before we even know her. The inspectors dispersed, their boots echoing down the stone corridors. Maigret remained alone with the pile of newspapers, the ink smudges darkening his broad fingers. He spread them across the desk, side by side, as though examining evidence at a crime scene. Each headline was a distortion, yet each held within it a kernel of the real. Someone had spoken to a reporter, someone who had seen more than they admitted to the police. The press had its own network of informants, concierges, waiters, clerks eager for a coin in exchange for gossip. Perhaps Maigret thought one of these threads might lead him to the truth faster than official channels. The thought unsettled him, but he did not dismiss it. Later that afternoon, he walked the streets himself, hat pulled low, pipe clenched firmly. At a kiosk near the Gare de l'Est, he paused to watch Parisians snatch up the evening editions, their fingers leaving smudges of ink as they turned the pages even before paying, their faces lit with curiosity, with the guilty pleasure of scandal. One man laughed aloud, tapping the sketch of the mysterious couple. Another shook his head in mock despair, as though Paris were forever a stage for such tragedies. Maigret moved on, stopping at a café where students argued over the meaning of the disappearance. Was it political, romantic, criminal? Each insisted upon his theory with the passion of youth, while the waiter rolled his eyes and refilled their glasses. In another corner, two women whispered fiercely, their eyes darting toward the door, as though the missing man himself might stride in, valise in hand. Everywhere he went, the story grew larger, swelling beyond the boundaries of fact. By the time he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, he felt the weight of the city's imagination pressing against him like a tide. That evening, when Madame Maigret set his supper before him, she too mentioned the story. "The neighbours talk of nothing else," she said, her tone disapproving. "They say the man will be found in the river before the week is out, or that he is hiding in Montmartre with a singer from the cabaret." Maigret chewed slowly, his gaze on his plate. He said nothing, but the faint tightening of his jaw betrayed his irritation. He disliked when rumour invaded even the sanctuary of his home, yet he could not blame her. She merely repeated what she heard. When he returned to his office that night, the newspapers lay waiting, fresh editions with bolder headlines, Dijon clerk in web of intrigue. Is he victim or villain? Beneath the words, another sketch more elaborate this time. A body sprawled beneath a lamp-post, blood pooling on the stones. The artist had gone beyond speculation to prophecy. Maigret stared at the image, his pipe smoke curling in steady rings. The city had already decided the ending. Now it was his task to prove it wrong, or to discover that the prophecy was, in its brutal simplicity, true. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his bulk, and let the smoke drift toward the ceiling. The press had taken hold, and Paris was no longer patient. The inspector felt the hours narrowing, pressing upon him with the inevitability of a story that demanded conclusion. Somewhere in the city, the man with the valise and the calm voice walked still, or lay already among the stones the caller had promised. The truth, Maigret knew, must be uncovered quickly before the ink hardened into history. The Seine has moods like a living thing. On certain nights it lies calm, reflecting the lanterns as though it were glass, but on others it churns with a slow unease, carrying with it the secrets of the city. The hushed quarrels overheard on bridges, the hurried steps that vanish into the mist, the faint splash of something heavy cast from the quay. On that night, Maigret felt the river brooding beneath the arches, its dark current whispering against the stone embankments, as though conspiring with the fog. He walked alone along the quays, his heavy coat buttoned high, his hat pulled low against the drizzle. His pipe glowed faintly, the ember a small beacon in the damp air. The Quai des Orfèvres had grown too close, too filled with the echo of newspapers, telegrams, and the restless pacing of subordinates. Here, beside the river, he sought the rhythm of thought. The Seine had often been his ally, its patient movement teaching him that cases did not yield to haste, but to immersion, to letting the atmosphere seep into one's bones until the truth rose naturally, like a body breaking the surface. The fog thickened near Pont-Neuf, cloaking the lamps in halos of dim gold. Somewhere, a barge moved slowly, its engine thudding like a heartbeat, its horn, a mournful bellow, swallowed almost instantly by the mist. On the steps leading down to the water, a fisherman sat motionless, line extended into darkness, as though oblivious to the hour. Maigret paused to watch him. Such men lived half in shadow, half in patience, and sometimes they noticed more than they confessed. The fisherman did not look up when Maigret's bulk loomed beside him. "River's high tonight," he muttered, his voice muffled by a scarf. "Carries things it shouldn't." "What things?" Maigret asked, smoke curling from his pipe. The man shrugged, his eyes fixed on the black water. Crates, bottles, sometimes more. A hat floated by earlier. Men lose hats, but this one sank too quickly as if it was not only a hat. Maigret studied him, weighing the words. Fishermen embroidered their stories, but not without reason. He left the man to his line and continued along the quay, the sound of the river filling the silence between his steps. As he walked, he thought of the caller's voice, calm and resigned, promising blood on the stones near Saint-Martin. He thought of the empty apartment on Boulevard Saint-Martin, the unsent letter left behind like a fragment of conscience. He thought of the press, spinning tales that grew larger with every edition. And he thought of Adrien Besson, the provincial clerk, a man described as punctual, discreet, unremarkable, yet who had chosen Paris for his disappearance. The pieces circled like eddies in the current, refusing to settle. At Pont-au-Change he paused again, leaning on the cold iron railing. The river flowed beneath, implacable, carrying its cargo of debris toward the sea. He lit his pipe anew, shielding the flame from the drizzle, and watched the smoke mingle with the fog until both dissolved. He felt the presence of the city around him, not in the clamour of streets or cafes, but in the undercurrent of whispers, the 1,000 lives intersecting and diverging beyond the reach of files and reports. Behind him, footsteps approached, measured, deliberate. Maigret turned to see Lucas emerging from the mist, his broad figure almost as solid as his chief's. The inspector removed his hat briefly, rain dripping from the brim. "I thought I'd find you here," Lucas said. "The men at the quay said you'd gone walking." Maigret grunted, neither surprised nor displeased. "And what news chases you through the fog?" Lucas joined him at the railing, his hands deep in his pockets. "Torrance has the telegraph records. No messages from Besson in Dijon after his disappearance. But there is one curious note, a telegram sent to Dijon from Paris 2 days ago. No signature, only the words, 'Tell her nothing. It is already decided.' The clerk at the office remembered the sender, nervous, polite, paying in exact change. He carried a brown valise. Maigret drew deeply on his pipe, the ember glowing brighter. The message fit too well, yet revealed too little. Tell her nothing. Which woman? The landlady? The woman in the cafe with gloves? Someone else altogether? And what had already been decided? Lucas shifted, his coat dripping steadily. There is more. A bargeman swears he saw two figures near the locks at Saint-Martin last night, a man and a woman. They argued softly, then fell silent. He thought nothing of it until he read the papers this morning. The inspector remained silent, eyes fixed on the black river. The Seine seemed to pulse with meaning, its currents echoing the fragments of testimony, a telegram, a quarrel, a valise. The city whispered, but never clearly. At last, Maigret straightened, his great frame casting a shadow even in the fog. "We will find them in the shadows," he said. "Not in the headlines, not in the telegrams, in the places where Paris keeps its secrets." They walked together along the embankment, their footsteps heavy on the slick stones. The fog thinned briefly, revealing a barge tied to the quay, its deck cluttered with crates and ropes. A man emerged from the cabin, lantern in hand, his face hollow with fatigue. He nodded at the policeman without surprise. The river folk were accustomed to the presence of law at odd hours. They knew too well that the Seine was both witness and accomplice. "Anything unusual last night?" Maigret asked. The bargeman scratched his chin. "Unusual? Everything is unusual when the fog is this thick. But I heard voices on the quay around midnight. A man speaking low, a woman answering only once. After that, only footsteps, then the splash of something thrown into the water." "A body?" Lucas asked quickly. The man shrugged. Could have been a crate, could have been nothing, but the river swallowed it whole. Maigret thanked him with a nod and moved on. He did not hurry. Haste disturbed the silence in which truth lay hidden. Instead, he let the rhythm of his steps match the river's flow, each thought settling like silt. By the time he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, the lamps inside glowed warmly against the damp. The duty sergeant handed him another telegram, this one from Dijon again. It confirmed what he already suspected. Adrien Besson had no debts, no enemies, no entanglements, at least none known. A man invisible in life, now too visible in absence. In his office, Maigret sat heavily, pipe smoke filling the space. The river's whispers still clung to him, the fog lingering in his coat. He unfolded the telegram and set it beside the letter from the apartment, studying them as though their words might, when placed together, form a confession. "Tell her nothing. It is already decided. Forgive me if it is too late." The phrases echoed one another, both resigned, both final. He leaned back, closing his eyes, hearing again the splash described by the bargeman, the fisherman's muttered words, a hat that sank too quickly. The Seine was keeping its secrets, as it always did. But secrets left traces, an eddy where none should be, a current disturbed by more than water. Tomorrow, he thought, he would send divers to the locks at Saint-Martin. Tomorrow he would walk the embankments in daylight, when the fog lifted just enough to reveal what the night tried to hide. But for tonight, he allowed the shadows of the Seine to seep into him, knowing they carried the truth he sought. The city outside settled into uneasy slumber, the press clamouring, the cafes buzzing, the fog swallowing, and Maigret, seated in his office with the river's damp still clinging to him, understood that the case was no longer about a missing clerk alone. It had become entangled with the city itself, with its rumours, its silences, its shadows cast upon the Seine. The days had shortened. By late afternoon, Paris was already sliding into dusk. Fog still drifted along the boulevards, thinner now than the night of the telephone call, but lingering in patches as if reluctant to leave. The lamps lit early, glowing halos in the chill, and the shops along the Grand Boulevards drew in their awnings one by one like tired eyelids. Inside the Quai des Orfèvres, the atmosphere was close, filled with the odour of wet coats steaming against radiators, the faint metallic smell of ink and typewriters. Maigret sat with his pipe between his teeth, the bowl tilted downward, smoke rising lazily as if the case itself exhaled through him. Janvier entered, hat in hand, his eyes restless. "He's here, Chief," he said quietly. "The man who asked to see you, he says he knows something." Maigret looked up slowly, heavy lids narrowing, as though to weigh the words before they were spoken. "Who is he?" "Calls himself Marcel," Janvier said. "No surname given. Insists on speaking with you alone." The inspector tamped the bowl of his pipe with his thumb, then set it in the ashtray. "Bring him." A moment later, the man appeared. He was neither young nor old, somewhere in the vague middle ground where clerks and minor functionaries spend their lives. His clothes were ordinary, though pressed too carefully, as though he had dressed for the occasion of his own uncertainty. His hands fidgeted with his hat, twisting the brim, but his face wore the mask of politeness. He bowed slightly as he entered. "Monsieur le Commissaire?" he said, his voice mild, trained for civility. Maigret did not rise. He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "Sit." The man obeyed, his eyes flicking about the office, the maps on the wall, the files stacked with quiet authority, the smoke curling in the air. He placed his hat on his knees and folded his hands over it, as though steadying himself. "You wished to speak," Maigret said. "Yes," Marcel replied, his tone careful. "I thought it my duty. There has been much in the papers. Too much, perhaps. And I thought, perhaps you should know the truth." "Truth is always welcome," Maigret said, though his voice carried no eagerness. Marcel cleared his throat. "I knew Besson. Not well, you understand, but enough to speak of him. We shared lodgings once in Dijon. He was quiet, reserved, but a man of principle, not one to disappear without reason. If he has done so, it was because of pressures no one else saw." "And you know these pressures?" Maigret asked. The man hesitated, then leaned forward, lowering his voice as though walls might listen. "There was a woman. Always a woman, is it not so? She entangled him. Not respectable. From Paris, I believe. She drew him into something beyond his depth. He was weak in that regard, weak in affection. If he fled, it was because of her, because she demanded it." Maigret watched him steadily, his large hands resting on the desk, motionless. "Her name?" Marcel hesitated again, his lips parting and closing. "I do not know it. He never told me directly, but one could see it in his eyes when he returned late, or when letters arrived with handwriting he quickly concealed. I believe she pressed him into debt. That is what clerks do when they lose their way. Debts, then shame, and then they vanish." The inspector relit his pipe, striking the match slowly, letting the silence swell between them, until Marcel shifted uncomfortably. At last, Maigret said, "You come here with half a story and expect me to believe it whole. Why now and not before?" The man's fingers tightened on his hat. "Because the papers speak of murder, because they speak of espionage, of scandal. I feared, if you did not hear the truth from someone who knew him, you would be led astray." Maigret drew deeply on his pipe, then exhaled, the smoke rising like a veil. He studied the man's face, the nervous flicker of his eyes, the rehearsed cadence of his speech. There was something too polished in the telling, too precise in the pauses. It was not confession, it was performance. "You worked with him in Dijon?" Maigret asked. "Yes, at the shipping office." "And you left?" Marcel blinked. "Circumstances. I sought other employment." Maigret leaned forward slightly, his bulk shifting, his gaze narrowing. Or were you dismissed? The man's mouth twitched. Dismissed? No, only a change. These things happen. The inspector let the silence linger until it grew heavy. Then he said almost casually, Strange, then, that no one in Dijon remembers you when we inquired. The man stiffened, his eyes darting. Perhaps they forget. Offices turn over, people come and go. Maigret puffed his pipe, unmoved. And yet you remember Besson's private affairs with such clarity. Letters concealed, debts imagined, a woman from Paris. Curious. Marcel shifted in his chair, his fingers worrying the brim of his hat until it threatened to tear. I only thought to help, he muttered. You thought to shape the story, Maigret corrected gently. His voice remained calm, almost tender, yet it carried the weight of inevitability. A confession disguised as warning. You tell me of debts, of a woman, of shame, but what you reveal most clearly is yourself. The man's face paled, his mouth opened, then closed again. He looked at the inspector, and for a moment the mask slipped. The polite smile faltered, the rehearsed words crumbled, and what remained was raw fear. Maigret did not press further. He leaned back, his great frame filling the chair, pipe smoke curling steadily. You may go, he said at last. Marcel blinked in astonishment. Go? Yes, return to your lodgings. The police will find you when you are needed. The man hesitated, then rose clumsily, bowing his head. He snatched up his hat and backed toward the door, his steps uneven. When he had gone, the office grew quiet once more, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock and the inspector's measured breaths. Janvier reappeared, curiosity written across his young face. What did he want? A stage, Maigret replied, tamping his pipe. A place to perform his innocence. He gave us nothing, yet in doing so he gave us everything. Janvier frowned. You believe he is involved? Maigret shook his head slowly. I believe he carries a burden too heavy for his words. Whether it belongs to him or to Besson, that we must still learn. That night, as Maigret walked home along Boulevard Richard Lenoir, the city seemed to pulse with hidden confessions. The cafes glowed with warmth, but inside them men spoke too loudly of things they did not know. Women hurried past with parcels, their faces half hidden by scarves, their eyes lowered. Everywhere, truth and falsehood mingled, each masking the other. In his apartment, Madame Maigret set supper on the table, her quiet presence a balm. She asked nothing, only watched him eat, noting the heaviness in his movements. Later, as he stood at the window with his pipe, he thought again of the man called Marcel. The tone of his voice, the nervous hands, the false certainty of his story. It was all a confession, though not of the crime he pretended to describe. And somewhere, perhaps in another dim apartment, Adrien Besson walked still, carrying the same resignation that had spoken through the telephone in the night. Or perhaps he no longer walked at all, and the Seine carried his silence beneath its shadows. Either way, the truth was circling closer. Maigret could feel it in the fog, in the press of the river, in the disguised confessions of men too frightened to speak plainly. The night was slow to relinquish its grip on Paris. The fog rolled in once more, thick and stubborn, refusing to lift even as the first faint hints of dawn began to break. The city seemed caught in a long breath, suspended between the final, fading whispers of night and the inevitable noise of a new day. Maigret, sitting in his office with the dim glow of the desk, lamp casting shadows across his face, felt as though he too was caught in that stillness. The case, still unresolved, had wrapped itself around his thoughts like the fog outside, refusing to dissipate. Each fragment, each clue had led to another dead end, another puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. But there was something about it, a weight, a presence, that told him the story was nearly over. The telephone rang again, its shrill sound cutting through the silence like a knife. Maigret didn't jump. He had been waiting for it. He reached for the receiver, and the familiar crackle on the line sent a shiver down his spine, though he could not have explained why. "Inspector Maigret?" The voice was familiar now, a low, almost inaudible whisper that had haunted him ever since that first call. "Yes," he replied, his voice calm, controlled. "It's you again." "There will be blood," the voice continued, its tone steady but heavy with an underlying finality. "But not in the way you think." Maigret's pulse quickened, but his exterior remained unmoved. "You've said that before. Blood on the stones, near Saint-Martin. But it hasn't happened yet." The voice on the other end of the line hesitated. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of static, the tension thick in the air. Then, almost reluctantly, the voice spoke again, its words clipped. "It's already happened, Maigret. It happened the moment I made the call. The rest is just inevitable." A coldness spread through Maigret's chest. He didn't need to ask for clarification. He already understood, perhaps more than he wished to. The game was over. The pieces were in place. The blood was not just a future event. It was already written, already sealed. Maigret replaced the receiver with a deliberate, almost reverent movement, the weight of the moment settling into his bones. He didn't need the phone call to tell him what would come next. He could feel it, as sure as he could feel the damp fog pressing against the windows. The city was ready to reveal its final act, and the only question left was whether he would be the one to write its ending. He stood, slowly, as if pulling himself free from the weight of the air itself. The fog still clung to the streets outside, and he found himself walking toward the door, without thinking, his steps automatic, his mind already a step ahead. He felt the shift inside him, the subtle but undeniable change in the rhythm of the case. It wasn't just about finding Besson or unraveling the mystery of the woman. It was something deeper now, something tied to the city itself. Paris was closing in, and Maigret was, for the first time, feeling the pressure of it, not from the facts, not from the clues, but from the atmosphere, from the shadows that lingered just out of sight. He walked through the empty corridors of the Quai des Orfèvres, past the desks where his men sat in quiet vigilance, the hum of their work blending with the distant noise of the streets outside. The rain had returned, tapping lightly against the windows, and Maigret, without speaking, slipped out into the night. The streets of Paris were quieter now, the early morning hour lending them an eerie, almost suffocating stillness. The lamps cast long shadows that seemed to stretch toward him as he walked, his coat collar turned up, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. The fog followed him, thickening with every step. When he reached the canal near Saint-Martin, he paused. The area was deserted, save for the occasional lone figure walking with their head bent low against the rain. But Maigret knew what he was looking for. It was not just the place. It was the feeling, the pulse of the city that had drawn him here. He had seen it before in other cases in the days before the conclusion was inevitable. A sense that everything was pointing toward a single moment. That moment was now. He turned down the narrow alleyway that led to the locks at the canal's edge. His footsteps echoed hollowly against the cobblestones, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the silence of the early morning. As he approached the water's edge, he felt the familiar unease settle in his chest. Something had shifted, but it wasn't just the case. It was the weight of everything that had come before, everything that had led him to this moment. And then he saw it. Not in the physical sense, not in the way a body would be found, but in the way he had learned to recognize the shape of a story unfolding. A small crowd had gathered, standing in a loose cluster near the locks. There was no official presence yet, no uniformed officers, but the murmurs in the air were thick with expectation. Maigret made his way through them without a word, his eyes fixed on the scene ahead. At the foot of the lock, lying in a shallow pool of water, was a body. Not the body of Bessel, not yet, at least, but someone whose appearance bore enough resemblance to the missing clerk to make Maigret's heart skip a beat. The man was face down, his arms splayed at odd angles, his clothing damp and clinging to his body as if he had been submerged for hours. His shoes, covered in mud, were the only things that seemed out of place, too neat, too well kept for someone who had been through what the Seine could do to a person. Maigret knelt beside the body, his hand steady as he turned it over. The face was pale, almost ghostly, the features familiar but strained, as though the man had been trying to escape something even in his final moments. His eyes were open, unblinking, staring straight up at the misty sky, and in his hand he clutched a small object, a torn piece of paper, crumpled but still legible. Maigret carefully pried it from the dead man's fingers, his eyes scanning the hurriedly scrawled message. I did not want this. Forgive me. It was never meant to end this way. Tell her. Tell her I loved her, but I couldn't. The message ended there, abruptly, as if the man had been cut off. Maigret's heart sank as the words echoed in his mind. He didn't need to read any further to understand what had happened. This was the end that had been waiting for them all along, the end that had been promised from the first phone call. He stood, the crumpled paper still clenched in his hand. There was no doubt in his mind now. This man, this Besson, had been caught in the city's grip, just as Maigret had been. The woman, the debt, the pressure, it had all been too much, and in the end the story had found its inevitable conclusion. The crowd had grown, but no one moved. Maigret could feel their gaze on him, the weight of their curiosity pressing on him like the fog itself. They wanted the story, the answer, the truth. But for Maigret there was no more truth to uncover. The city had already told its tale. He looked at the sky, now lighter, the first hints of dawn pushing through the fog. He had been right all along. The city had not wanted justice, it had wanted closure, and now in the quiet murmur of the crowd and the stillness of the river, it had found it. Maigret turned and walked away, his mind already moving on. It was over. There was nothing more to say. The blood had been spilled, the story had ended. And in the end, that was all Paris wanted.